12 years is a long time to avoid a town with a population of 6,000 people, one stoplight, and exactly one woman I still thought about more than I'd ever admit out loud. Every reunion invitation that showed up in that time went straight in the trash, unopened, until this was the first one I actually attended, the first time I'd let my mother talk me into showing my face back home at all. I made it 4 hours into that night before Rosalie Marsh leaned close enough that I could smell her perfume over the cheap gymnasium punch and asked me the one question I did not have an answer for. "Did you ever get my letter? I'm Jonah Winters, 30, a structural engineer who has spent the last decade building bridges in places that are not this one, specifically because places that are not this one don't have Rosalie Marsh standing in them, running a bookstore, being exactly as unfairly unforgettable as she was in high school. My mother had been working on me about this reunion for the better part of a year, ever since the invitation showed up in her mailbox instead of mine, because I'd never bothered updating my address with the alumni committee. "You'll regret it if you don't go," she said, in the specific tone mothers use when they already know something you haven't admitted to yourself yet. Some things you can't keep avoiding just because you're good at building bridges everywhere except the ones that actually need fixing. I told her that was an unfair metaphor from a woman who'd never once needed an engineering degree to see the obvious. I flew in 4 days before the reunion, ostensibly to visit her, actually to spend 3 sleepless nights convincing myself I could handle seeing Rosalie Marsh again after 12 years without making a single fool of myself. I failed within the first 4 hours. "What letter?" I said, which is possibly the least useful sentence a man has ever produced while standing under a banner that said "Class of the Welcome Home" in balloons that had mostly deflated by hour 4, in a gymnasium that still smelled like floor wax and the same cheap punch they'd served at every dance since 2010. Her face did something complicated, hope curdling into something closer to dread, fast, before she caught it and smoothed it back down. "Never mind," she said. "It doesn't matter. Forget I said anything." It mattered. I could tell it mattered by the specific way she said it didn't. "Here's what you need to know about Rosalie Marsh before anything else happens. She never left. While the rest of us scattered, me to engineering school and a decade of contracts in cities I couldn't have found on a map at 18, she stayed, took over her aunt's old stationery shop on Main Street, renamed it The Corner Page, and turned it into the kind of place that sells fountain pens to people who don't need fountain pens because she makes the whole ritual of writing feel like it matters again. She still organizes her display shelves by color instead of genre, which drove me up a wall in high school and which I found myself, 12 years later, standing in her shop earlier that same afternoon, admiring for reasons I didn't fully want to examine. I'd gone in that afternoon under the flimsy pretext of buying a birthday card for my mother and spent 20 minutes watching Rosalie help an elderly customer pick out stationery for a granddaughter's graduation, patient and specific in a way that made the whole transaction feel like a small ceremony instead of a sale. She kept a chipped mug of tea going cold on the counter the entire time, the same brand she'd always favored back in high school, and wore her hair pulled back with a pencil stuck through it instead of an actual hair clip, a habit that had apparently survived a full decade completely intact. I bought the birthday card. I did not buy the courage to say anything beyond, "You probably don't remember me," to which she'd simply raised an eyebrow and said, "Jonah Winters, I have a bookstore, not amnesia," before ringing up my card like the conversation hadn't just rearranged my entire evening. I found out about the letter in pieces over the course of a very long, very strange night, because Rosalie Marsh has never once in her life said the important thing directly on the first try. "You really don't remember," she said 20 minutes later once we'd drifted to a quieter corner of the gym, away from the DJ playing songs neither of us had liked even in high school. "Senior year, the week before graduation. I gave Brooke Ellison an envelope for you." "Brooke," I repeated. "Brooke gave me nothing. I would remember an envelope, Rosalie. I've spent 12 years replaying that whole month." Her jaw tightened. "Then someone lied to one of us for 12 years, she said, "and I'd very much like to know which one of us it was." "Why Brooke? Why not just find me yourself? Because you left for that summer engineering program 4 days early, remember? You barely said goodbye to anyone. I panicked and handed it to the first person I trusted, who I knew would see you before your family finished packing the moving truck. She crossed her arms, something old and raw flickering across her face. I've replayed that decision more times than I'd like to admit. If I'd just walked to your house myself instead of outsourcing my own courage, this whole conversation wouldn't exist. You couldn't have known Brooke would sit on it for 12 years. No, she agreed. But I could have known better than to hand something that mattered to someone else to deliver for me. I learned that lesson exactly once, apparently, and then spent the next 12 years still doing variations of the same thing, letting other people hold the parts of my life I was too scared to carry myself. I wanted on record that I did not come to this reunion looking for a decade-old mystery. I came because my mother threatened to stop sending care packages, and because some cowardly, hopeful part of me wanted one more look at a woman I'd built an entire personality around missing. For what it's worth, I said, I spent most of that engineering program convinced you'd never actually liked me back. I built a whole theory around it. I was very thorough. I had supporting evidence and everything. What evidence? You never once said anything. 3 years of sitting next to each other in Mrs. Halloway's class, and you never said a single word that wasn't about homework. I was 17 and terrified, Jonah. Terror doesn't always look like silence from the outside, but it's usually exactly that on the inside. I know that now, I said. Genuinely excellent timing on that particular piece of self-awareness. Only took me a decade and a half. An old classmate, Derek Alton, no relation to the other Derek, a coincidence Rosalie would later find darkly funny, stumbled past us toward the punch bowl, recognized us both, and paused just long enough to say, "Wow, Winters and Marsh, back together. That's a blast from the past," before wandering off, entirely unaware of the small earthquake he'd just walked through the middle of. "People used to say that," Rosalie said once he'd gone. "Back in high school. Winters and Marsh. Like we were already a unit before either of us had done anything to earn it. I remember I used to pretend it annoyed me." "Did it?" "Not even slightly. I used to go home and write it in the margins of my notebooks, actually, which I would like retroactively struck from the record, given how this conversation is going." She almost smiled at that, the first real crack in the careful composure she'd been holding since the punch bowl. "Duly noted. I'll add it to Brooke's growing list of things this reunion has forced into the open." We found Brooke by the punch bowl 40 minutes later, 3 drinks in, laughing too loud at a joke nobody else at the table seemed to find that funny. Rosalie didn't ease into it. She never eases into anything that matters. It's one of the things I'd forgotten I loved about her. "Brooke," Rosalie said, voice level in a way that took visible effort. "The letter. Senior year, the one I gave you for Jonah." Brooke's laugh died somewhere in her throat. Her eyes flicked to me, then back to Rosalie, then down at her plastic cup like it might offer an escape route. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, too fast, in the exact same too fast voice I'd just watched Rosalie use 20 minutes earlier, which told me everything about where this particular family tree of lies had started. "Brooke. It was a long time ago, Ro." "Then it'll be a short conversation," Rosalie said. "Did you give it to him or not?" The table had gone quiet in that specific small-town way where everyone pretends not to listen and fails at it completely. A few of the old crowd, people I hadn't spoken to in over a decade, whose names I was still half remembering as the night went on, had gone still with their drinks halfway to their mouths, sensing, the way small towns always sense these things, that something real was happening. Brooke set her cup down, hands trembling slightly, and looked at me instead of Rosalie, which felt like the tell before the confession even started. "I read it first," she said. "I wasn't supposed to, I was jealous, okay? Everyone knew you liked Jonah, Rosalie, and I'd liked him since sophomore year and never said anything. And I read 3 lines of that letter and I couldn't make myself hand it over. I told myself I'd give it to him the next day, once I'd worked up the nerve to just be normal about it. Then the next day turned into graduation, and graduation turned into you two never talking again. And I told myself it didn't matter anymore because you'd both moved on. I didn't move on, Rosalie said very quietly. I have spent 12 years assuming he read it and just didn't want to say anything back. Do you understand what that did to me, Brooke? I built an entire decade around a rejection that never actually happened. I know. I've known for 12 years, and every single reunion, every time your name came up, I told myself I'd finally say something, and every single time I chickened out again, because admitting it meant admitting what kind of person I'd been at 17, and I didn't want to be that person anymore. So it was easier to just let you both keep believing whatever you'd already decided. That's not an apology, Brooke. That's an explanation. I know, Brooke said, and to her credit, she didn't try to dress it up as anything better than what it was. I don't have a good version of this. I was scared and selfish, and I let that fear cost you 12 years, and I'm sorry, and I know sorry doesn't hand you those years back. I stood there holding a cup of punch I had not touched in 15 minutes, feeling like a man who'd wandered into somebody else's demolition site and gotten hit by the wrong falling beam. 12 years of a story I'd told myself. She never felt the same. I imagined the whole thing. I was an idiot kid with a crush that meant nothing to her, collapsing in real time in a middle school gymnasium that still smelled like floor wax and teenage cologne. Where's the letter now? I asked. Brooke's face went pale in a way that told me the answer before she said it. I still have it, she said. I couldn't throw it away, and I couldn't give it to him, so I just kept it. It's in a box in my closet, with a bunch of other stuff from that year. I can get it. Tonight if you want. I should have burned it years ago out of guilt, but some part of me always knew this day would come, and I think I kept it so I'd have proof, when it finally did, that I wasn't making the whole thing up. Rosalie didn't say anything for a long moment. I watched her decide something. The same decisive stillness I remembered from every important choice she'd ever made in front of me, back when we were 17, and I hadn't yet learned to recognize it for what it was. Bring it, she said finally. I want him to actually read it. 12 years late is still better than never. Brooke nodded, grabbed her keys off the table and left without finishing her drink, moving faster than I'd seen anyone move all night. Like getting that envelope out of her closet and into our hands was the only way she knew how to start making 12 years of silence right. We didn't wait around for the rest of the reunion after that. Rosalie and I ended up outside, in the parking lot behind the gym, under a security light that buzzed like it was personally annoyed at both of us, waiting on a letter that had apparently been sitting in a shoebox for over a decade. I need you to know something while we wait, she said, arms crossed against the cold, in case the letter says something that makes this weird. I'm engaged. I felt that land somewhere just under my ribs, a specific, familiar ache. Congratulations, I said, in the flattest voice I have ever produced in my adult life. Don't do that. Do what? That voice. The one you're using right now. She looked at me directly, which she has always been better at than I am. His name's Derek. He's fine, he's kind and steady, and he's never once made me feel like I was waiting for something better to come along. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement, Rosalie. No, she admitted, quieter. It's not. I've noticed that myself, actually, more than once, usually around 2 in the morning when I can't figure out why I keep putting off setting a wedding date. She pulled her jacket tighter, not quite meeting my eyes. I wasn't going to tell you that part, but given the general theme of tonight being buried truths finally getting some air, it felt hypocritical not to. How long have you two been together? 2 years. Engaged for 4 months. She kicked at a loose piece of gravel, watching it skitter under the security light. He proposed at his sister's wedding. Very sweet, very public, everyone crying, the whole thing. I said yes because it felt like the reasonable next step, and because I genuinely do care about him, and because I'd stopped believing the other kind of feeling was something I actually got to have. I'd filed it under teenage nonsense a long time ago. Or tried to. And now? Now, I'm standing in a parking lot with the person that teenage nonsense was apparently about the whole time, waiting on a letter I wrote when I was 17. So forgive me if my filing system feels a little less reliable than it did this morning. I didn't say anything clever back. I didn't have anything clever in me at all. Standing in a parking lot finding out the girl I'd spent 12 years failing to get over might have spent those same 12 years failing to get over me too. Engaged to a man she described with the enthusiasm most people reserve for describing decent weather. Brooke showed up 20 minutes later, envelope in hand, looking like a woman walking to her own sentencing. She held it out to me without a word, and I stood under that buzzing security light and opened a letter that had been waiting 12 years to reach me. The envelope had gone soft at the edges, the kind of wear that only comes from being handled and re-handled by someone who couldn't decide whether to throw it away. The ink of my name on the front slightly faded, but still unmistakably hers. The same careful, rounded handwriting I remembered from 100 past notes in Mrs. Halloway's class, back when passing notes still felt like the height of romantic risk. It wasn't long. Rosalie was never a woman who wasted words, even at 17. It said in her small, careful handwriting that she'd been in love with me since 10th grade, that she was terrified I'd leave for engineering school and never look back, and that she needed me to know before I left, whatever happened next, that loving me had been the easiest and best decision she'd ever made, and she didn't want to spend her whole life wondering what would have happened if she'd stayed quiet. There was a line near the bottom, slightly smudged, like she'd hesitated over it long enough for the ink to bleed a little, that read, "If you don't feel the same, please just let me keep this letter as proof I was brave once. I don't need you to love me back. I just needed to stop pretending I didn't love you." I read it twice. Then I looked up at the actual woman standing 3 feet away, 12 years older, engaged to a man named Derek, watching my face like she was trying to read an entire decade off it in real time, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, breath fogging faintly under the buzzing security light. "I would have stayed," I said. "If I'd read this at 17, I would have found some way to stay, or brought you with me, or done something reckless and stupid that probably would have ruined both our lives in a completely different way. But I would have stayed." "I know," she said. "That's exactly why I've spent 12 years telling myself it was better this way. Easier to be heartbroken over a letter that got lost than to know for certain you'd have chosen me, and things still might have fallen apart anyway." "Is that what you actually believe?" She was quiet for a long moment, arms still crossed, breath fogging faintly in the cold parking lot air. "I don't know anymore," she admitted. "I've believed a lot of convenient things for a long time, Jonah. Tonight's made it very hard to keep believing most of them. We didn't resolve anything that night. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story like the letter fixed everything on the spot. And it didn't." Rosalie drove home to a fiancé who had no idea any of this had happened, and I drove back to my mother's guest room with a 12-year-old letter folded in my jacket pocket, and neither of us called the other for 4 days, which were, without question, the longest 4 days of my adult life. My mother, to her credit, did not ask a single question the first night, which was somehow worse than if she had. She just set a plate of reheated casserole in front of me at 11 at night and sat across the table while I ate it in silence, staring at a folded envelope I'd set beside my glass like it might combust if I looked away from it too long. "You going to tell me?" she said finally. "Or am I supposed to guess based on the fact that you've read that same piece of paper 4 times since you sat down?" I told her. All of it. The letter, Brooke, 12 years of a story I'd apparently gotten completely wrong, and the fact that the woman it was about was now engaged to a man named Derek, who sounded, by every account, entirely reasonable and kind, and exactly the sort of person you'd want your daughter to marry if you didn't already know she'd spent over a decade half in love with somebody else. "Well," my mother said when I'd finished, in the specific tone of a woman who has been proven right about something and is choosing, generously, not to gloat about it. "I did tell you that you'd regret not going, You didn't predict this specific scenario, Mom. I didn't need to predict the specifics, Jonah. I just know my son, and I know that boy spent an entire senior year mopey about a girl he wouldn't admit he liked, and then spent the next 12 years finding reasons to work as far away from her as the job market would allow. Some patterns don't need a crystal ball. I spent the next 3 days doing very little that could be called productive. I walked past the corner page twice, both times without going in, telling myself I was giving her space, which was at least half true and at least half cowardice wearing space's clothing. I reread the letter more times than I'll admit to in a public forum. I texted Marcus, a buddy from the engineering program, not the reunion, someone with zero stakes in any of this, a garbled 3-paragraph explanation of the entire situation at 1 a.m, and got back a single reply. Man, you need to just call her, which was infuriatingly correct. She's the one who finally called on the 4th day before I'd worked up the nerve myself. I remember exactly where I was standing, my mother's kitchen, doing dishes I didn't need to do, mostly to have somewhere to put my hands. I ended it, she said, no preamble, the same directness I remembered from the punch bowl confrontation. With Derek. 3 days ago, actually. I should have called sooner, but I needed to know I was doing it because it was true, not just because a letter showed up and knocked something loose. How'd he take it? About as well as anyone takes finding out they were the reasonable choice instead of the true one. She exhaled, and I could hear, even through the phone, how much that honesty had cost her. He deserved better than being someone's steady harbor while she kept looking at the horizon. I told him that. He didn't love hearing it, but I think some part of him already knew. He said, actually, and I'm quoting him directly because it stuck with me, I always felt like I was competing with someone I couldn't see. I just didn't know his name until this week. That's rough. It was. He wasn't cruel about it, which almost made it worse. Cruel I could have handled. Understanding just made me feel like the villain of my own engagement. Her voice caught, just slightly, on the last word. I cried after he left, Jonah. Not because I wanted him back. Because he'd spent 2 years being kind to a version of me that was never fully there, and he never once deserved that. You're not a villain, Rosalie. You're just someone who spent 12 years mourning a rejection that never happened and finally got proof of it 40 minutes before you'd have married someone as a consolation prize. When you put it that plainly, it sounds almost noble instead of just messy. I contain multitudes, I said. Mostly bad timing and worse instincts, but occasionally something useful comes out. I'm sorry, I added after a moment, and meant it, because I understood, better than most people, what it costs to build a life around someone who's only ever getting the second-best version of your attention. Don't be sorry for me, she said. Be sorry you moved 4 states away instead of just staying long enough to fix the thing you actually broke 12 years ago. That's fair, I said. Extremely fair, actually. I build things professionally, and I still managed to avoid the one repair job that actually mattered. She laughed, short and surprised, the first unguarded sound I'd heard out of her since the gym. That's the worst professional joke I've ever heard, and also somehow correct. I've had a whole career built on catching problems before they matter, Rosalie, and it took me 12 years to notice the one I actually let slide. Careful, keep going and you'll talk yourself into an actual metaphor. I contain multitudes. I already told you that too. You did, twice now, in the same conversation. I'm starting to suspect it's the only sentence you know how to say when you're nervous. It's one of 3. The others are considerably worse. Now I have to know the other 2. Not tonight. Some things need to stay mysterious a little longer, or you'll get bored of me before you've even had the chance to properly start. I've had 12 years of practice not getting bored of you, Jonah. I think I'll manage. We talked for almost 2 hours that night, longer than either of us had probably planned, catching up on 12 years in fragments, her aunt's retirement and the handoff of the shop, my early years bouncing between contract cities before I'd found something like a rhythm, the specific loneliness of building things in places you never intend to stay. Somewhere around hour 2, the conversation slowed into something quieter, less like catching up and more like 2 people relearning each other's cadence, and neither of us wanted to be the one to hang up first. We talked almost every night after that, for the 3 weeks between that first phone call and my flight back. Small things, mostly. She'd tell me about a customer who'd come in looking for the perfect pen for a proposal, and I'd tell her about a beam calculation that had kept me at the office until 9, and somewhere in the exchange of those small, unremarkable details, I started to understand that this was what I'd actually missed for 12 years. Not the grand gesture of her, but the ordinary texture of her days, the specific shape of how she moved through an afternoon. "You know what's strange," she said, about a week in, during one of those late calls. "I keep waiting for this to feel like too much, too fast. Like I should be more cautious, given that I just ended an engagement a week ago. But it doesn't feel fast at all. It feels like the slowest, longest thing I've ever done. 12 years slow." "I've been describing it to myself like a report that finally came back clean," I said, "after everyone assumed for over a decade that something must be wrong." That is somehow the least romantic and most accurate thing anyone's ever said to me. "I contain multitudes, I already told you that." "You did? I'm starting to believe it." I flew back 3 weeks later, a work trip that wasn't strictly necessary, routed through the nearest airport to her town instead of the one closer to the job site, a fact I did not explain to my supervisor and do not intend to. I spent the flight rehearsing 4 separate versions of what I might say when I saw her again, and discarded all 4 the second she actually pulled up to the curb, in a car with a check engine light she'd clearly been ignoring for months, wearing the same pencil-through-the-hair look from the bookstore, like no time had passed since the reunion at all. "You look like a man who rehearsed a speech on the plane," she said the second I got in the car. 4 of them, actually. "Let's hear the worst one first." "Absolutely not. I have some professional pride left. You had a letter written to you that you didn't even open for 12 years, Jonah. Your professional pride and I are already well acquainted with its limits." She drove us both to the corner page after hours, unlocked the front door, and sat me down at the little reading table by the window, where she still kept the same pens from high school, organized, predictably, by color. The shop smelled like old paper and the specific waxy scent of the candles she sold near the register. Quiet in the particular way a place only gets once the open sign's been flipped for the night. "I found something," she said, and set our old senior yearbook on the table between us. The one we'd apparently both signed for each other, and then, somehow, in the chaos of graduation and a letter that never arrived, never actually exchanged. Mine was still tucked in a drawer at my mother's house, my half-written message to Rosalie sitting unfinished on the inside cover for 12 years, because I'd chickened out of finishing it the same week she'd apparently written an entire love letter and handed it to the wrong person. "I never gave you mine either," I admitted. "I wrote about 4 sentences and panicked. It just says, 'Have a good summer,' and my phone number, which I'm now realizing is criminally underwhelming compared to what you wrote me." "I noticed that too, actually," she said. "About an hour ago when I dug both of ours out of a box in my closet, right next to the letter." She flipped hers open to a blank inside page, uncapped one of her ridiculous fountain pens, and started writing something new, right there. 12 years and one very complicated night after the fact. I watched her write instead of reading it right away. The specific, deliberate slowness of a woman choosing every word this time, instead of rushing it into an envelope she'd have to hope survived the journey. The scratch of the pen against the page was the only sound in the whole shop, steady and unhurried, nothing at all like the frantic 17-year-old handwriting in the letter Brooke had finally handed over. When she finished, she turned the book around and slid it across the table. It said, "12 years late is still better than never. Ask me again sometime whether I'd choose you. The answer's already yes." I didn't say anything clever back. I've noticed over the course of this entire story that I never do, when it matters most. I reached across the little reading table, cupped her face in both hands, and the kiss that followed started careful. The kind of careful you use when you're checking, silently, whether 12 years of almost is finally allowed to become something real. Then it went warm, her hand fisting in the front of my jacket like she was afraid the moment might slip away from her a second time. And then, for one long, unhurried second, It went past warm entirely, past a shoebox full of old letters, into something that made an entire empty bookstore feel like exactly the right place for it to happen. We broke apart to the sound of the shop's ancient bell over the door, which neither of us had touched, ringing softly from nothing more than a draft, like the building itself had an opinion about the timing. "For the record," I said, "I'm keeping both yearbooks. Yours, mine, all of it. I've got 12 years of catching up to do on sentimental hoarding." "You've always been terrible at grand gestures, Jonah. 4 sentences and a phone number. Truly tragic." "I've improved," I said. "Ask me again in 12 years. "I'd rather not wait that long a second time." "Fair. I'll aim for something grand and immediate instead. Give me a week to think of something worthy of the occasion." A week. Bold promise from a man whose last written declaration took him 4 sentences and a full decade of avoidance to produce. "I contain multitudes, Rosalie. Occasionally those multitudes include follow-through." "We'll see," she said. But she was smiling when she said it, the kind of smile that didn't look like it was bracing for disappointment anymore. 6 months later, I moved my workbase permanently to the regional office 2 hours from her town, close enough to actually build the kind of life neither of us had let ourselves imagine at 17. The move wasn't entirely smooth. My supervisor wasn't thrilled about losing me from the bigger contracts, and it took some maneuvering to find a position that didn't feel like a demotion. But I've since learned that some decisions are worth the friction of making them. Brooke, for what it's worth, apologized properly, in person, in a conversation that took most of an afternoon and ended with something that wasn't quite forgiveness yet, but was, at least, an honest start toward it. Rosalie says these things take time, the way everything real takes longer than the version you rehearsed in your head. I believe her. She's usually right about the things that matter. I got to see her in her actual element again a few weeks after I'd settled into the new place, on a Saturday morning when a shipment of ordered stationery came in wrong. 3 boxes of the wrong ink color, right before a wedding calligrapher client needed to pick up an order for a rehearsal dinner that same afternoon. I expected panic. Instead, Rosalie called 2 competitors she'd normally consider rivals, sweet-talked one of them into loaning her the correct stock for the day, rearranged her entire backroom inventory system in under 20 minutes, and handled the frazzled calligrapher with the same patient, specific calm I'd first watched her use on that elderly customer buying graduation cards. By the time the crisis had passed, she'd lost maybe an hour of prep time and 0 customers, and she blew a stray piece of hair out of her face like the whole morning had been mildly inconveniencing at best. "You're terrifyingly good at that," I told her, once the calligrapher had left, order in hand, entirely unaware of the chaos that had preceded it. "I've been running this shop alone for 6 years, Jonah. Every day is a small emergency. You'd know something about that. I don't build with ink and paper, but I'll allow the comparison. Generous of you. The corner page still sells fountain pens to people who don't strictly need them. There's a small display now, near the register, of 2 worn high school yearbooks, side by side, open to the pages we finally wrote each other. Hers finished 12 years late, mine finally allowed to say more than 4 underwhelming sentences. Customers ask about them sometimes, drawn in by the handwriting or the visible age of the paper, and Rosalie tells the short version, leaving out the parts that are just for us. I let her, because she tells it better than I ever could, and because watching her tell it, every single time, still catches somewhere just under my ribs in the best possible way. Brooke came by the shop last month, unprompted, and left a small gift on the counter without saying much. A new fountain pen. The good kind. The kind Rosalie herself would have recommended to a customer looking for something meant to last. There was no note. Rosalie didn't need one. Some apologies, it turns out, are better delivered as small, specific gestures than as long speeches, and I think all 3 of us have gotten a little better over the past year at delivering the true thing instead of the convenient one. My mother, for the record, has never once let me forget that she called this before I did. She keeps a framed photo now on her mantel, one Rosalie sent her, of the 2 of us at the shop's front counter, taken by a customer who didn't know she was capturing anything more than two people laughing at a joke neither of us remembers anymore. Underneath it, in my mother's handwriting, on a small card she refuses to remove. Some bridges just needed 12 years and a stubborn woman with a fountain pen. I don't disagree. Rosalie asked me not long ago whether I regretted the 12 years, all that time spent building other things in other places, assuming a door had closed that had actually just been sitting unopened the whole time. I told her the truth, which is that I don't, not entirely, because the version of me who left at 18 wasn't ready for what she'd written in that letter. And the version of her who wrote it wasn't finished becoming the woman who runs a bookstore with the same patient specificity she brings to everything else. Some things just need the full 12 years of settling before they're actually ready to hold anything permanent. I believe that. She started to believe it too, on the days it doesn't feel like an excuse for lost time. What would you have done if a letter you never got finally showed up 12 years too late? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.